It is 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late autumn. Markets closed 8 hours ago. The trading floors of Frankfurt, London, and Paris are dark and quiet. Cleaning crews push mops through the corridors of the European Central Bank. Every algorithm is sleeping. Every settlement queue is waiting for morning. And somewhere deep inside a server farm outside Frankfurt, a system called Target 2 is processing the last few €100 million of the day's transactions, humming along as it has every single night for 2 decades. This is the moment most people will remember as the last normal night. We think war destroys nations with missiles. We think the first casualty is a city. But history, when it tells the brutal truth, says something else entirely. History says the first casualty was always the balance sheet. The city burned later. The ledger broke first. Europe was not going to be defeated by warheads. It was going to be foreclosed upon. And the bankruptcy had been building for 30 years before the first radar alert flashed red. Let that sit with you for a moment. Picture Europe at the height of its modern confidence. The single market encompasses 500 million consumers with a combined GDP of $16.8 trillion. It is the largest trading bloc on Earth. German engineering fills every garage from Lisbon to Warsaw. French wine fills every cellar. Dutch logistics move 40% of all maritime goods that enter the continent through the port of Rotterdam alone. The European Union has won the Nobel Peace Prize. Prosperity is not a promise. It is a proven product, on the shelf, available in all sizes. Bonuses clearing in Frankfurt's banks that could fund small African nations. The European Central Bank sitting in its tower like a cathedral of monetary reason, presiding over the most ambitious monetary experiment in human history. One currency, 19 economies, one set of interest rates, one collective future. It felt invincible. It looked invincible. That was the trap. Beneath the gleaming surface, the foundation was rotting. The economic flaw was not a secret. Economists had been screaming about it since 1999. It had a technical name, the optimum currency area problem, but its street name was simpler. You cannot run one interest rate for Germany and Greece at the same time without eventually destroying one of them. The euro was not a currency. It was a financial straitjacket sold as a wedding dress. Germany could borrow at near zero rates and build surpluses. Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal borrowed at those same low rates and built deficits. By 2010, Greece was carrying public debt at 147% of its GDP. Italy was sitting at 118%. The entire southern flank of Europe was technically insolvent and being kept alive by the fiction that Germany would never let the euro fail. But that fiction had a price tag, and the bill was still unpaid when the radar stations lit up. Here is where the antagonist enters, not a general, not a missile engineer. It is called Target 2. Trans-European Automated Real-Time Gross Settlement Express Transfer System. Every single euro transaction between Eurozone banks flows through this system. Every overnight loan, every sovereign debt settlement, every interbank payment across the 19-nation bloc runs through this one invisible artery. By 2023, the Target 2 imbalances had grown to 1.1 trillion euros. Germany was owed 1.1 trillion euros by the rest of the Eurozone through this system. It was the largest secret debt arrangement in human history, hidden inside a technical footnote that nobody in a prime-time news broadcast had ever explained. It was a loaded gun that Europe carried in its pocket every single day, telling itself it was a pocket watch dot, and when the alert came, that gun went off first. The signal arrived at 11:51 p.m., not through military channels, through the overnight repo market. A major German bank, we will not name it, but its initials are on buildings in Frankfurt, put out an emergency liquidity request. At 11:53 p.m., $47 billion overnight at any rate available. In the repo market, where banks borrow short-term cash using government bonds as collateral, that kind of emergency request is the financial equivalent of a scream. Within 4 minutes, every automated risk system on Wall Street flagged the anomaly dot by midnight. European sovereign credit default swap spreads were detonating. When those spreads blow out, it means the market has decided that the government might not pay its debts, a level not seen since the absolute peak of the 2012 Eurozone crisis. At 12:07 a.m., Greek CDS cleared at 890 basis points. That is not distress pricing. That is the market pricing in sovereign default. Within 72 hours, the euro fell off a cliff. At 11:47 p.m., the euro was trading at $1.07 against the dollar. The same radar reports being leaked onto encrypted telegram channels, the same whispered intelligence that was surfacing through back channels between Washington and London. They were not waiting for official confirmation. They were already positioned. They had been positioned for months because the smart money always knows before the official announcement. At 12:11 a.m., the automated trading systems at 3 of Europe's largest pension funds triggered their war protocols. The sell orders went live. Approximately 340 billion euros in European sovereign bonds hit the market simultaneously, looking for buyers. In the middle of the night, with no buyers visible, the bond market froze. Completely froze. This is the moment that most people will never understand, because it happened in a place no camera can film and no journalist was there to describe it. By which Spain funds its schools stopped functioning at 12:14 a.m. on a Tuesday night. Not because of a missile, because of a sell order, because of mathematics, because of 30 years of accumulated vulnerability, finally meeting 30 seconds of panic. Sovereign bonds stopped trading. Sovereign bonds stopped trading. Read that again. The documents that governments use to borrow money, the financial instruments that underpin every euro of public spending across the continent, became unsaleable pieces of paper in the space of one automated trading cascade. Now let us talk about the smoking gun, because there is always one, and it is always a document, and it is always more brutal in its language than the history books remember. Now let us talk about the smoking gun, because there is always one, and it is always a document, and it is always more brutal in its language than the history books remember. Inside the European Central Bank's emergency protocols, the classified playbook that exists for exactly this kind of scenario, there is a provision called the Transmission Protection Instrument, or TPI. It was created in July 2022 as a direct response to the fear that war or crisis could cause fragmentation of the Eurozone bond market. The TPI allows the ECB to buy unlimited quantities of sovereign bonds from stressed member states to prevent their borrowing costs from spiraling out of control. The problem is that TPI requires a formal decision by the ECB Governing Council. The Governing Council has 26 members spread across 19 countries. It meets physically or via secure video link at 12:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, with communication networks under active cyber attack and satellite links degrading. 8 of those 26 members could not be reached. 4 of the secure video links had failed. The quorum was compromised. The decision could not be formally made. The TPI could not be activated. The one firewall that could have stopped the bond market meltdown sat inert inside a Frankfurt server, waiting for a meeting that could not be called. That is the foreclosure notice. That is the document that's sealed. At 12:31 a.m., Italian Prime Minister's office released a statement through whatever functioning communication channel remained. It was 4 sentences. It said that Italy was experiencing extraordinary financial market conditions and that the government was exploring all options for fiscal stability. In the language of sovereign finance, this is what bankruptcy sounds like before it has the courage to say its own name. Markets understood. Italian 10-year bond yields, the rate at which Italy borrows, spiked to 9.2% in secondary trading. That is effectively a closed door. At 9.2%, Italy cannot service its existing 2.7 trillion euros in public debt. Mathematically impossible. The interest payment alone would consume 40% of all government revenues. Italy had not been hit by a single missile. Italy was already insolvent. The contagion moved like a blood clot through an artery. Spain's borrowing costs hit 7.8% by 12:40 a.m. France, the second largest economy in the Eurozone, the country that sits on the UN Security Council, saw its spreads blow out to 320 basis points over German bonds by 12:55 a.m. levels associated with near-junk credit territory. At 1:07 a.m., SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, the messaging network that allows banks to send money to each other across borders, experienced its first major disruption. Cyberattacks had been targeting SWIFT's European node since 11:48 p.m. For 23 years. Since 9/11, SWIFT had maintained that it was the one financial infrastructure that could not be taken down. It had redundancies. It had backups. It had backups. This is what sovereignty looks like when it goes broke. Not a flag being torn down, not a leader in chains. It looks like a payment message that never arrives. A payroll that cannot be processed, a hospital supply chain that cannot pay its invoices, an energy company that cannot settle its gas contracts. It looks like the ordinary machinery of civilization grinding to a halt, invisible, silent, catastrophic. At 1:33 a.m., the Dutch Central Bank made an extraordinary unilateral decision. With Eurozone coordination impossible and the Target 2 system showing catastrophic imbalances, the Dutch National Bank froze all outward euro transfers from Netherlands-domiciled accounts. They cited emergency financial stability provisions under Dutch law. It was legal. It was also the formal beginning of the end of the euro as a functioning single currency. If the Netherlands can fence off its money, so can every other nation. And they would. Within 90 minutes, Finland, Austria, and Slovakia had issued similar executive orders. The euro had become 19 different currencies wearing the same coat. Sovereignty is solvency. And at 2:04 a.m., European sovereignty began to fracture along exactly the lines that economists had mapped in 1999 and every year since. The productive North and the indebted South permanently misaligned, now officially separated by financial emergency decrees. The European Financial Stability Mechanism, the €500 billion emergency fund built specifically to prevent sovereign collapse, could not be deployed. Its deployment requires unanimous approval from member states. 3 member state finance ministries could not be contacted. The mechanism sat untouched. €500 billion of firepower, neutralized by a bureaucratic consent requirement that assumed peacetime communication would always be available. That is what €500 billion looks like when the process breaks. It looks like zero. That is what €500 billion looks like when the process breaks. It looks like 0 by 3:15 a.m. The economic consequences were compounding faster than any single institution could track. European pension funds were down an average of 31% in mark-to-market terms, representing approximately €2.1 trillion in paper losses. European banks, most of which held significant quantities of Southern European sovereign bonds as safe assets under the Basel framework, were technically insolvent under any honest accounting. 17 European banks would fail the next morning's stress tests if stress tests could be run, which they could not because the regulators' systems were also down. Workers in the dawn hours who tried to access their bank accounts via ATM found a simple message: service unavailable. Not insufficient funds, not a bank holiday, service unavailable. The most honest thing a collapsing financial system ever says. 47 years of European integration, of binding currencies and harmonizing regulations and creating the largest peacetime economic structure in human history, and it communicated its death in 2 words on a small illuminated screen: service unavailable. The question then becomes the one that haunts every economic collapse in history. How long does it take to pay the bill? How many generations carry the weight of one catastrophic night? Look at what history teaches. Germany after World War I carried its reparations debt from the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, until October 3, 2010, 91 years. The final installment, €69.9 million in bonds, was settled by the unified German government, paid to creditors whose grandparents had not yet been born when the